Uxa had arrived at the virtual forum ahead of me and was standing near the balcony watching the crowds of humanity materializing into their places in the staggered tiers on the opposite side of the great venue. I said hello and approached to give her a hug. She responded without noticeable delay, which must have been due to the controller AI anticipating her reactions. "Thank you for inviting me to accompany you here in Tier 1, Jon," she said. I just nodded. She would normally have attended as a Tier 2 member with the other research project heads. I invited her to join me in the Prime Tier as she was my longtime friend and partner. Also, after our recent stunt at the Forbin complex, we were still linked in the minds of most. There was nothing I could do about that, but having her with me in Tier 1 at least demonstrated that I valued her opinions. The Prime Tier was reserved for the various directors of humanity. These were quasi-political positions that wielded authority over various areas of our society. Back in the early years of our new civilization, I had grudgingly accepted the necessity of these positions after realizing how many decisions needed to be made on a daily basis that were beyond the simple logical decision trees of the AIs. Together, I and the early leaders in the template colonies had developed the role of the director. They would be elected to 10-year terms by the various divisions of humanity under their control. They would be under the oversight of each other in the AI Advisory Council. We had tried to make the positions less desirable for power seekers by requiring the long-term period of public service before one could be installed as a director. The holder also had to forever forfeit various personal rights and excessive property holdings. There was also a firm term limit of 30 years, after which the director had to retire from public service for a period of no less than a century. The process of impeachment was by anonymous vote after an impartial review by UDEX. It had only been used twice in over a century. The system had worked well and required little refinement over the years. I had never served as a director despite a great many attempts to draft me into the role. A few of my offspring had served, however, with my grandson Ben being the most recent to pursue the service. Although I was not a director and had never been one, I was still permitted to join them in the prime lower and frontmost tier. Officially, it was assumed that this was as a courtesy, but in truth it was because of the authority via my control of all AIs that I maintained over them all. Despite my trying to keep that knowledge hidden, some directors became aware of it soon after taking power, if not before. I took my place beside Ux at the front of our balcony, overlooking the virtual assembly arena. We did not speak, as we had recently talked extensively after my meeting with the new picket. While she surveyed the gathering, I clandestinely inspected her virtual appearance. It was an interesting hybrid of her current shell and that of the older body she'd had back when we were together as man and wife. One difference that was apparent with this digital version was that it lacked the enlarged cranium and visible mind-link data ports of her current modified Genius shell. I was used to her specialized shell, but it was very noticeable. It was no surprise that she had made her virtual appearance more human and without the augments. Omu joined us in the virtual balcony, but remained standing towards the rear. We stood as there were no chairs. There was no need to sit, as fatigue from standing was simply not simulated in this virtuality. In front of us were the warped, amphitheater-like meeting galleries. There were 5 ascending levels or tiers, with the lower and closer tiers being reserved for humans who wielded power or possessed extraordinary knowledge or skills. These lower tiers were also permitted more interaction with the testimony of the forum. For example, as Tier 1, I could interrupt or ask questions at will during the ongoing proceedings. When I say warped, it was because all other attendees appeared to be in front of our prime tier balcony as if we were the focus of the meeting. In reality, everyone present had a view similar to ours. To each of them, they would also appear to be the focus of the forum, with all others standing in opposition. Between our balcony and the others was a presentation dais. Meeting information would be projected above the dais, or beings could give testimony on it. From our viewpoint, they would be facing us, but everyone would share this viewpoint. The main benefit of the bizarre perspective was that we could see every single being present here with us. From the directors in their similar, smaller, exclusive prime-tier galleries, just opposite the dais, to all of the other larger tiers and their mass group galleries rising behind and above. I could make out individual faces up to Tier 3. Above that, the groups became too large and were blurred out unless I triggered a magnified view. Tier 5, the farthest tier, was just a colorful mass of vague shapes. This tier represented the bulk of humanity in this day and age. It dawned on me as I studied those far massings that I had never attended a global virtual meeting as a member of their lofty viewpoint. I'd always been down close to the action in Tier 1 or 2. I'd have to attend a global meeting from Tier 5 once, just to see what it was like. I shifted my attention closer and just across the dais to the semicircular cluster of prime-tier directors' galleries. Most of the occupants had their heads down, indicating that they were off in private meetings or viewing other data streams. A few were actively viewing the other attendees just as I was. When our eyes would meet, we nodded in greeting. Some did so with smiles and respect, while others kept a more neutral expression, betraying nothing. There were plenty who thought me a pariah from either my inherent power or my recent actions at Forbin, or both. Above and behind the directors were the Tier 2 group members. These were the heads of the major research projects and other critical infrastructure groups. There were also a few individual galleries in Tier 2. These were humans who were heroes for some reason or other, or who had other notable achievements deserving recognition. As I scanned across the groups and individuals in Tier 2, I caught the eye of someone I recognized. It was M. Sabal, the hermaphrodite administrator of the Forbin complex. I cringed as I recalled its preferred use of that offensive pronoun, raised its hand in greeting when it saw that I had noticed it. I saw the Herm make the conversation gesture towards me and noticed an accept box appear in my vision overlay. I clicked on affirmative, wondering what the Herm wanted. Hello, John. I wanted to thank you personally for how you handled the aftermath of your unauthorized use of the Forbin facility 2 years ago. Covering the cost of all damages which occurred at the facility, including the overtime spent performing repairs, was appreciated, the administrator said. I noted that it had politely not reminded me that the damage had been my and Ux's fault. No problem at all, Administrator Sabal. Again, I apologize for any mental anguish or additional work our experiment caused to you or your staff. I hope the additional items added to the compensation package are proving beneficial. Yes, the vacation packages are proving very popular with the general staff. Thank you for those, the administrator replied. On top of the substantial monetary payments made to the Forbin group, I'd offered other benefits. One of these was the use of some of my properties by Forbin personnel for rest and relaxation purposes. The property most in demand was my island retreat, Heels in the Sand. I had offered to provide travel and accommodation for up to 7 guests at a time on the island for 3 years. It had been going better than I had expected, and I would probably extend a more limited invitation to other groups after the current 3-year offer was up. Those would be for profit, as I was already beginning to get offers that included payment. To accommodate these guests, I'd constructed a series of small beachside bungalows. I also procured the use of an electrojet to cover transportation to and from the island. The vacations were proving very popular and were quickly helping to improve my reputation, at least with the technical staff who worked at the data center, and who had been most affected by our actions there. Iudex appeared on his simple throne, set off to the side of the central dais. This meant the forum was about to begin. Administrator Sabal and I concluded our private conversation, and I focused my attention on the dais. Iudex's virtual appearance was in the form of a hooded humanoid figure dressed in black robes. Its deep cowl hood mostly hid the AI's features, although you could see 2 small starfire points of brightness where its eyes would have been. It was here to judge any legal matters and monitor the protocols of the forum. In effect, it served as the meeting room's moderator. With a tooth-rattling thrum, Iudex tapped his crystalline gavel, bringing the forum to an active broadcast state. A shimmer passed over the throngs of humans, and I heard a clear tone announcing that the forum was open. Minerva's AI appeared on the dais in its typical virtual image of a hovering large gray stone obelisk. The immobile and apparently solid symbol was perfect to demonstrate the unending resolution for the AI in charge of the defense of the solar system. It spoke in an authoritative, gender-neutral voice and described the current state of our solar system's defenses and the circumstances around the recent detection of the enemy transmission. I had reviewed summaries of this technical data already, So I mostly ignored the words spoken by the AI. Instead, I watched the reactions of the masses of humanity. It was clear many were learning the details of the transmission for the first time. I used the unlimited magnification allowed in virtual to zoom in close to various segments of humans in the more distant, higher tiers. There was an endless variety of figures. Some were realistic and human-like in appearance, while others were fantastic caricatures of cartoonish or historical figures. Most were focused on the words being spoken by the AI, as all were aware that this was a pivotal point for our species. "Omu, how many are attending this forum?" I asked quietly, after making sure my words were set to local. As a Tier 1 member, I had the ability to override and interrupt any current ongoing testimony, and I did not want to make a faux pas by having my question heard by the entirety of humanity. 2,463,114 living or active humans, Jon, Omu answered. This represents over 98% of the current near-Earth population. Also present in the form of proxy-bearing simulations are 314,063 humans who are elsewhere in the solar system, outside of the mandated 30-second communications lag limit, just shy of 3 million humans. Our current civilization, much smaller than the almost 8 billion I had shared the planet with back before the reset. Despite the current population being just a fraction of that of the past, it was clear that ours was much more intimately connected with each other and the world around us. I thought back over the past 2 centuries, where we'd grown humanity from just a few thousand to this current number. The goal of the first century had been to actively push human growth and rapidly expand the population. The last 80 years, we had slowed such aggressive expansion and just let humans reproduce as they wished. Growth was now much slower and more balanced. The latest forecast showed we were adding less than 100,000 a decade. The new growth was also being spread across the entire planet and the space stations and colonies of the solar system. This meant that with the anti-urban laws still in effect to keep our population decentralized and less vulnerable, we still lacked permanent large cities. I was just fine with that, as I still had memories of the congestion and chaos of the cities of my youth. Omu ignored my musings and continued. Many of the far-flung proxies have already attended local forums where much of this information was presented and considered. Any conclusions reached in those gatherings will be integrated into the decisions made during and after this forum. Minerva soon finished its summary. Other AIs and a few of the directors gave quick progress reports on their areas as they related to the enemy transmission. Finally, humanity was ready to learn the actual contents of the enemy's transmission. Ayudex briefly explained the background of the near-parity iteration in the SRP and the level of current knowledge which the enemy agent had been allowed. This set the stage for Pickett's testimony, and my old neighbor appeared on the dais. Pickett bowed to the masses, introduced himself, and began his sales pitch, for lack of a better term. Again, since I already knew the contents of his message, I instead watched the crowd as he made his case. I saw expressions of wonder and amazement as he explained the need for humanity to shift all of its efforts towards building a new ark to continue spreading the assemblage across the galaxy. I was a bit surprised and concerned at the low levels of open hostility or doubt which I observed. When he had wrapped up his main points, various individuals or groups began asking the enemy operative many of the same questions I and my companions had broached during our private meeting a few days ago. He answered in a similar way, adding little to what we had previously covered. Occasionally, someone would ask a question that contained references to our new wormhole technology. The virtual Pickett would look confused, as it had not been allowed any knowledge of the new technology, as its response would only be speculation. Ayudex would reset Pickett's awareness back to before the question was asked, and the question skipped. Eventually, the theme of the questioning shifted to why humanity must join forces against the greater Hemru threat. Suddenly there was an interruption. Off in the 4th tier, about a dozen humans stood and began shouting. Their interruption was quickly moderated by Udex, and the group became frozen as they were placed under suspension. "Who are they?" I asked Omu. "It was one of the more prominent doubter groups, Jon," the android replied. The doubters were this day and age's version of the flat earthers of my old era. They were conspiracy theorists who believed that the assemblage did not exist and that their attack had never happened. Beyond that, various doubter splinter factions broke down around even more bizarre theories. One even claimed that I was the only real alien, and this world was my experiment and slave-breeding colony. 50 years ago, members of that group had been detected planning a physical attack on my person. Naomi had dispersed the group and tightened its security watch on me ever since. It also increased the monitoring of other potential adversarial groups. With the interruption handled, the back-and-forth discourse with Pickett resumed. I split my attention between following the questioning and watching the reactions of the crowd. It continued to be mixed. I was surprised at how many of the forum's attendees were currently watching me instead of Pickett. Most were smiling or had neutral expressions, but more than a few were clearly unhappy. It seemed I had no shortage of enemies. "Naomi, how many here do you suspect of currently wishing me harm?" I subvocalized, not wanting to alarm Uxa by posing the question openly to Omu. Instead of answering verbally, Naomi did something more dramatic. Columns of colored light appeared all around the forum, extending skyward from various individuals and small groups. There were tens of thousands of shafts of light, all red in various shades and brightnesses. I did not need a legend to understand that the brightest crimson shafts were those that hated me the most. Luckily, these numbered around 100, but of these, there were over 24 that were a pulsating bright crimson that caught my attention. The majority of the indications were a fixed dull red, with many barely visible. I reasoned that these indicated only mild annoyance and were lesser threats. Jesus, nothing like a wake-up display like this to set a guy in his place, I exclaimed subvocally. Yes. Note that the peak high number of hostile humans occurred 2 months ago, directly after your exploits at the Forbin installation. The numbers have declined by 11% since. If Naomi intended this to soothe me, it failed. There were still a lot of people here who hated me. I used the zoom function to look at some of those who had pulsating crimson indicators. I flinched when the second person I inspected was staring back at me with naked loathing in her eyes. The person's virtual appearance was that of a middle-aged woman. She must have noticed that I was focused on her as her eyes tightened even further. She was not alone. Her companion appeared to be a similar-aged male, and she must have signaled to him somehow because he also turned to look at me. His expression of naked hatred matched hers. They must have shared some unknown signal as both simultaneously turned away from me and resumed watching the questioning of Pickett. "Who the hell are those two?" I asked Naomi, again subvocally. "The two humans are Lilith and Sigmund Modesto, John." Naomi didn't say anything further. The AI knew that I was all too familiar with the Modestos. We had crossed paths almost 10 years ago when their children had been killed in an accident during a historical learning expedition which I had guided. I knew their hatred stemmed not only from the loss of their kids, but also from the brief follow-on legal battle that had ensued. You see, the Modestos were followers of Amor Fati. I assume from their visceral open hatred that they are still avid followers of Amor Fati? I asked the AI. Yes. It appears they have also become aware of your recent policy changes regarding the dependence of all followers of Amor Fati. This has clearly incensed them. Do I have to worry? I think not, John. I have doubled the routine patrols of all waters around your island. The airspace coverage has been similarly increased. In low and medium orbital space, I have altered the trajectories of the Overwatch fast response launchers and directed energy weapon platforms. Beyond that, the lunar defense perimeter under Minerva's control is also under my direct oversight. You should be fine. I did not respond as the information Naomi had just revealed to me sank in. I wanted to think the information I had just heard was some form of joke, but I knew the AI had been serious. I'd realized that she had always kept a close watch on my safety, but I had no idea of the extent of those measures. That I had never noticed was a testament to how stealthily the AI could operate. I decided to take advantage of the near-complete gathering to do something I generally shied away from over the centuries. Naomi, please show my clones if they are in attendance. The red-hued columns faded away and were replaced by light green columns spread across the higher tiers of the gathering. I counted 28 of them. There were originally 46 clones in existence, but over the past century and a half, 12 had chosen to die a permanent and final death without being reshelled, and I knew that 2 were gone from Sol's system after having volunteered to be part of the crews of the early interstellar ships. Their fate remained unknown, as those ships were still in transit. I felt the familiar awkwardness as I gazed upon my closest kin. I thought of them as my clones, but time and circumstances had rendered that less accurate. I activated the Identify function and scanned their projected names. The one I was hoping to find was not present, which wasn't completely unexpected. I had generally made a habit of avoiding my copies as they were different enough that the strangeness in our interactions was overwhelming. The differences were originally caused by their mental editing after they were created and before they were installed into the template colonies. This editing occurred to make them comfortable with their surroundings and their imposed mates. When I had freed the Earth from the control of the Master AI, Ukes and I had visited these colonies. I had quickly learned to interact with my clones, just like I interacted with the other 8 cloned humans in each colony. On the rare times since when I had encountered one of my clones, this had remained the norm. Now, 170 years later, with multiple reshellings of their physical bodies, most today looked like strangers. I used my zoom feature to inspect a few more closely. They seemed healthy, and many were with groups of humans who must have been their spouses, families, or friends. I frowned a bit as only 3 clones were in Tier 3. The rest were in Tier 4 and 5, with the bulk in Tier 5. Their lack of achievement was due to a combination of their mental tampering and, sadly, too much of my core traits. The same traits which had probably led me to be a recluse a millennia ago when life had given me lemons and I had retreated to my acreage. The third John Abrams clone I chose to inspect was inspecting me back. I flinched slightly as our eyes met and widened simultaneously. My soul brother smiled and nodded as I pulled back a bit embarrassed. For a moment, I had the strange sensation of what it would feel like to be me sitting in those lesser important tiers and looking across at myself seated in the prime tier. What would it feel like to know I was a clone of that human who was responsible for all of this being here in this day and age? I shivered unconsciously. The uncomfortable feelings I had when I interacted with my copies were as strong as ever. I was glad they felt something similar and had avoided me over the centuries as much as I had generally avoided them. I began to daydream as I relived various past encounters. A few had been positive, such as the departure ceremonies of the 2 who had left the solar system. Most had been accidental encounters. A few had asked me to speak at their death celebrations. I remained deep in thought long enough that Naomi caused the colored indicators to fade away. I was jarred back into the present when Pickett's image on the dais vanished. His part of today's forums was now over. Uxa was up next, and her virtual image left my balcony and reappeared on the central dais. She was to give testimony on the state of the wormhole technology research. I listened as she went over the current progress and the near-term likely progression of the Far-Reach team's research. She then answered dozens of questions from the various tiers on the expected results of her research. She concluded her report with the statement we had agreed upon previously, that all signs indicated that wormhole technology would be useful in defending us from our enemies. Humans did not have to submit to the assemblage or the Hemru. I gave Uxa's virtual presence a hug when she finished testifying and returned to our viewing balcony. "Good job, honey. You've convinced me," I said. After a short delay to account for communication lag, she pinched me. I was surprised at how much pain got them through the virtual limiters. "Jackass, of course, I convinced you. Now to see if I convince the forum," she said. With the scheduled testimony period now concluded, open debate began. As Naomi and Omu predicted, 4 main options emerged. From worst, in my opinion, to best they were. First, to comply with the enemy and build and launch a replacement arc. This would prevent the assemblage from attacking as it approached our system, and also help spread humanity's mind data to other worlds. The second option was to do nothing aggressive towards the assemblage. Some things would be done, like stopping all construction on the current faux arcology mass dwellings. We would use the saved resources to accelerate our efforts into constructing interstellar colonizer vessels. The third option was to appear to comply with the enemy as a ruse. We would construct an arc, but instead of it being filled with the resources to repair the first enemy arc after it passed the Earth, this new arc would instead be a raider and would rendezvous with the enemy Ark and destroy it. I love the general idea behind this option, except for one thing: the enormous system-wide effort needed to build and launch the Raider Ark. This third option would also do nothing about the imminent threat of an attack by the Hemru. We'd still have to face that risk if it occurred. The fourth option was to further accelerate the wormhole research, with the goal of using it to attack the approaching enemy Ark. With luck, we could destroy it well before it passed our system and before it attacked our world because of our visible non-compliance. That same wormhole technology would be used to defend us from any attacks by the Hemru. I prefer that final option. It was a gamble, but would disrupt our civilization the least. It would also eliminate the threat of the assemblage in a way that was fast and certain. Fast enough to possibly prevent them from sending word of our threat to any previously established colonies they had already created. Discussions continued among the forum attendees. Most of the discourse occurred between groups in the lower three tiers, but occasionally a comment or question from a higher tier made its way into active consideration. One idea which I thought had merit came from the fifth tier. It was a delaying tactic that suggested we should transmit back to the approaching Ark ship a request to retransmit their previous message. We would claim that the original message had been garbled and mostly indecipherable. This would buy Earth more time to formulate its response, while simultaneously costing the enemy the resources and energy to retransmit the data. The AI Advisory Council considered the idea and reported that it was likely the enemy would believe our request and not consider it a delaying or diversionary tactic. After nearly an hour of back-and-forth deliberations, I asked Omu to summarize the current standings of the debate. Currently, 35% of attendees favor the plan to not comply with the enemy agent's request and instead use the wormhole technology to directly attack the enemy. 61% of attendees wish to delay and reconsider the matter further at some point in the near future. A second conscientia forum would be needed within 6 months to a year from now. 4% of attendees wish to follow the recommendations of the enemy agent and begin construction of the second Ark immediately. Roughly 2/3 of these favor the plan to reduce the threat of an early assemblage attack, while the remaining 1/3 feel that the Hemru are the greater threat to our species. They wish to ally humanity with the assemblage and spread with them to endless other stars, Omu reported. These new tabulations were close to the earlier predictions the AI had made. I was happy to hear that a higher number now favored using the wormhole technology to directly attack. This meant that Uxa's testimony had had some effect. She smiled when I acknowledged this point to her. It still pissed me off that almost 4% of the attendees wanted to capitulate to the enemy's demands. Coincidentally, one of the Tier 1 directors supported this option and was currently on the dais and making her case. She was pushing the point that building a second Ark was the lower-risk option for our species and had the side benefit of also spreading humanity to other worlds. As the director finished her argument, I was interrupted by a high-priority message. The sender was Hannah Crather Venezia. She was a friend and had also been my temporary parental partner back when I had my 5th child, Larissa Daring. She was also the clone of the original sheltering human Hannah Crather. I wondered what she wanted and opened a private chat channel to speak with her directly. "Hannah, it's been a long time. What can I do for you?" "John, do you hear what that bitch is saying? She wants us to join with the assemblage. She's a director, for Christ's sake." I was not completely surprised at Hannah's visceral reaction. Of all the humans alive today, and this included me, she had the greatest reason to hate the assemblage. The original Hannah Crather had been an older teenager back in the early 21st century when the assemblage had wrecked our world. And unlike the other 8 humans who survived those times by being put into suspension in underground bunkers, Hannah had lived through many months of the attack's aftermath before she was discovered. The enemy AI who had found the nearly dead girl had placed her into biosuspension in its underground bunker without her consent. It had also tried to wipe her mind of many of the traumatic events the teenager had suffered because of the attack. The mental scars from these alterations had caused Hannah, and by extension her clone copies, to develop certain issues and instabilities. Now, even almost 2 centuries later, those clones still had problems with both the original trauma and the mental repair efforts. They were emotional and reacted unpredictably at times. I had become aware of one of the clones, Hannah Crather Venezia, who lived in the Ukrainian template colony, after I had been sent to investigate an incident where she had bludgeoned Li Cheng, her abusive male partner, to death. After I had pardoned her for killing her partner, we had become friends. I had assisted her in using the AIs to make further attempts at healing her mental issues. One of these was to have Naomi reimplant all the erased memories which had been removed and archived when the original Hannah Crather had first been placed into biosuspension. The results were mixed. The poor girl no longer felt the loss of the missing memories, but now she had to live with the knowledge of what she had suffered through during and after the enemy attack. The memory restoration had created new issues, with some being severe enough that the procedure was not attempted with any additional clones of Hannah. We had become friends as I had helped her work through her issues. We'd grown even closer when 8 decades later, I had commissioned her to act as a mid-womb to carry my 5th child, Larissa Daring, to term. Larissa had been fully engineered and shared no actual DNA with Hannah, but she was still the girl's mother in all other regards. I'd enjoyed Hannah's company enough during the 3rd trimester period when she had physically lived with me that I hired her to stick around for the next decade to act as a nanny and mother figure to Larissa until she became a teenager. After Larissa had reached base maturity and went off on her own, my daughter had chosen to remain in contact with Hannah. Last I had heard, they remain close friends to this day. John, we can't allow humanity to assist or join with the assemblage in any way. IUDEX won't allow me to testify, and the lower tiers are ignoring my pleas to do so. Can you do something? She begged. What do you want me to do? I want to be heard. I want to remind everyone just what the assemblage did to us. Get them to let me testify. I sub-vocalized to Naomi. Can you make it so Hannah can address the forum? Of course, John. I'll take care of it, Hannah, I said into our private message channel. She did not respond for a short while. Naomi must be relaying to her the details of how she would be allowed to speak. Finally, she replied, "Oh, thank you, John." "No problem, Hannah." "Knock their socks off," I replied. "I'll try." We terminated our private message chat just as the current director concluded her arguments. After her image disappeared from the dais, and before open debate could begin on the points which had been raised, IUDEX announced that special testimony would now be heard. I noticed Ux lean forward to see who would be giving the unexpected testimony. On the dais, the image of an innocent-looking, blonde-haired young woman appeared. I smiled as this version of Hannah was very uncommon. The woman was usually in an older, more mature shell and often gravid from pregnancy. This was because of her choice of occupation as a midwomb. Her love of children and her fervent belief in the human repopulation effort had led her to this calling. If I had to guess this, she had carried and borne at least 250 children over the past 18 decades. She even had her maternal shell customized to bear children more efficiently. Her choice to now appear as a young, vulnerable-looking teenager was clearly intentional. "Isn't that one of the Hannahs?" Ux asked. IUDEX answered for me when it introduced the speaker to the forum as Hannah Crather Venezia. After giving her name, the AI explained that she would be giving testimony as a friend of the forum about the true character of the assemblage. Both descriptions were intriguing enough that people would pay extra attention to her words. I hoped the curiosity would deflect my role behind the sudden insertion of Hannah's testimony into the forum's itinerary. "Venezia, she's the Hannah clone who was the mother to your daughter, Larissa, correct?" Ux asked before adding, "The one we retrieved the archived memories for?" I nodded. "I see she is registered as a Tier 4 attendee. I wonder how she is able to address the forum directly. Did you know she was going to be testifying?" she asked next after the communication lag. "I didn't know until a minute ago," I replied carefully. Ux just stared at me. I saw her lips tighten just a bit. She was smart enough to deduce what I had done. Fortunately, she was also smart enough to remain silent about it. I just returned her stare until we both turned to watch as Hannah started speaking. "My fellow humans, let me begin by telling you the story of a young girl who lived a long time ago." Hannah did a great job with her backstory. She kept it condensed but included enough details of her idyllic life as a child growing up in old Utah to draw the audience in. As she described the world of her youth, I caught her true message. It was a subtle attempt to destroy the argument that New Pickett had made about the assemblage attack having saved our species and world from our own destructive tendencies. Hannah's version of history included our growing environmental awareness and responsibility. She talked about how people in her era had begun the shift towards less destructive ways of living, once she had established that humanity and old Earth had not been doomed after all. Her story turned much darker. She went into detail about the enemy attack and the terrible period that had followed. As she wove her story through the destruction and her desperate struggle to survive the aftermath, I was watching the audience's reactions. Most were enraptured with the young girl and her story. She was reaching them. She described the killings, the rapes, including her own, and the constant near starvation she and the other survivors had to endure. I saw the clear signs of emotional distress on many in the audience. Hannah pulled no punches. She admitted to surviving towards the end by eating human flesh, as the normal food sources were long since exhausted. She described the struggle to simply stay warm with the near-constant blizzards and freezing conditions in the nuclear winter aftermath caused by the enemy impactors. She included her bouts of sickness from the radioactive and chemical pollution from the failing infrastructure, as well as from the nanoplague being spread by the enemy's machines. After her descriptive history lesson, she really turned up the rhetoric and began to hammer home the point that it was stupid and suicidal to join forces with an enemy who had sterilized our world and reduced humanity to just 9 surviving humans. As I watched her gesturing widely, I knew that this speech would be remembered with the great speeches of the past. "Wow," Ux said as Hannah paused before her finale. "She is really giving this crowd both barrels." Her statement made me smirk. Ux had probably remembered the phrase from watching old movies with me. But I had to agree with her sentiment. I was proud of Hannah. I was suddenly struck with a weird realization. Hannah's shouts and gestures at the crowd reminded me of those made by Adolf Hitler during his speech to his Nazi Congress. I hoped her appearance as a cute blonde teenager instead of a toothbrush-mustachioed man with a receding hairline would disguise the resemblance from the history buffs who might have studied the long-dead dictator. After Hannah finished her speech, there was a long moment of stunned silence as the audience digested her words. Then a significant amount of applause broke out. Hannah was clearly relieved and gave the crowd a big smile. She thanked the audience, and her image left the dais. As the deliberations began again, I saw the indicator in my peripheral that said I had just received a textual message. It was from Hannah. "Thank you, Jon. I would like to meet with you in person in the near future. Please contact me in a few days after I've had a chance to calm down." I chuckled. I remembered how emotional she could get, and her advice to wait sounded prudent. Ux and I watched the forum's deliberations continue for another half hour. I thought I detected a subtle shift in the mood of the crowd. It was either because the deliberations were winding down and boredom was setting in, or Hannah's speech had made some impact. Ix beat me to it when she spoke. "Oh, Moo, how do you predict Hannah's testimony affected the deliberations?" 48% of attendees now favor using the wormhole technology to attack the enemy as soon as possible. 49% wish to still wait and consider the matter further at a future time. Just under 3% now wish to follow the recommendations of the enemy agent and begin construction of the second arc. This is a reduction of a third over the previous percentage wishing to submit to the enemy's demands, the exotic-looking android reported. The forum's official itinerary was now concluded. A resolution passed which said that for now we would wait and see. A future forum was scheduled to discuss the matter further in a year. It was hoped that the wormhole technology would continue to develop in the meantime. It was also decided to go ahead with the plan to transmit a message back to the assemblage arc, asking it to resend its previous transmission. This would hopefully provide cover for our lack of shifting to new arc construction while we waited. Attendees began to leave as the floor was opened up to the higher tiers. The debate and discussions would continue, but without a full quorum. The discourse would be preserved in the official record, though, and this gave everyone who wished to contribute a chance to say their piece. I was not going to stick around. The AI Advisory Council and Naomi would let me know if anything of importance was discussed after we left. "I'm going to take off, Uxa. Have you found out when you will be heading to Mars yet?" I asked. Yes, it's been fun, John. There is a shuttle leaving for Mars in 3 weeks. I am not yet sure if I will be on that one, however, as there are a few last-minute experiments here I wish to oversee in person, she replied, after the annoying 3 seconds of delay. I hugged her goodbye, and then waited politely while Omu did the same. When they broke apart, Uxa's image vanished as her consciousness reverted to her physical shell back on the lunar L2 space station. I nodded when Omu looked at me, and I saw the forum meeting hall fade away as I was ejected from the virtuality. A few seconds later, I woke up in my shell. I was no longer in the main great room, but instead was standing near the access portal to the tube shuttle. I looked down and saw that I was already undressed, only wearing swim shoes and a loose beach robe. Omu had remembered my goal of a swim after the forum and had already prepared my shell to save time. As I rode the small, transparent shuttle down the sloping tube to the beach, I could see Omu assembling the makings of an outdoor beach cookout. I did not see any signs of Adele either in the water or sunning herself on the sand. Omu, is Adele still in virtual? I asked. Yes, John. Her augment reports that she should be joining us in less than an hour. Her historical group is holding a follow-on forum to discuss the testimony of the global meeting. I don't remember her mentioning that they would be having an after-meeting. The unexpected testimony of Hanna Krather Venezia contained a wealth of previously undisseminated historical data of interest to Adele's group. They are considering the new information. I predicted Adele would love to meet Hanna in person. I would have to see if Hanna would allow me to bring her along when we had our face-to-face. Those concerns could wait, though. Right now, the warm ocean was calling. There were better things to worry about.